Welcome to the podcast dedicated to living a revenue culture. Most companies want to not just survive in the short term, but they want to thrive for the long term. Revenue science tells us that if you're going to thrive for the long term, the first thing you have to do is optimize your people, because you can never maximize your profits until you optimize your people. This podcast is dedicated to helping everybody understand how to actually make that real. And today, we're thrilled to have Brett Plains with us. And Brett and I have been friends for a long time. He's currently the Arizona and Northern California commercial market leader for PNC Bank. He's got a bachelor's degree from ASU, a master's from Thunderbird School of International Management, and certificates from the University of Washington in a master's in banking, and then one in executive leadership. So Brett, welcome. I'm glad to have you here.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Rick.
So, I know some of your story and what you've done and how you built your teams and all that, but I'd love to have you tell us, how you got to where you are today, because I'm not sure you took the standard path.
Yeah, well, I would say that would be very, very accurate, not the standard path. And really, there's no output in an aptitude test that we take in high school that says, hey, you want to be a commercial banker. That output doesn't exist. So I got into banking right when I was about 18 years old as a bank teller. And, I'm kind of known as the village idiot in most scenarios, generally because I'm the first person to raise my hand as a project comes up or a new role. And I generally don't have any idea what I'm doing when I raise my hand. And so I started off as a bank teller, then a teller manager, to a personal banker, to a premier banker, to a private banker, to a business banker, to a wholesale banker, to a workout banker, ended up in commercial banking, did some large corporate banking, some investment banking, and then ultimately ended up as more of a sales leader about 7 or 8 years ago, building some high performance teams and fixing problems that certain banks at those times had. And so I'm really a revenue generation guy, a fix it guy, and let's really maximize our potential. And so that's kind of the quick version. And on the schooling side, I really wasn't ever a good student in high school, or even for that matter, undergraduate. It was really once I got to pick the topics I like to learn about. And as you know, Rick, I'm a life learner. I read about a book a week, maybe two. And so really it wasn't until grad school that I really decided, education is really, really important. And in my opinion, is the key to success. And so I've got a couple other certificates as well that we didn't talk about there in the opening. But I'm always the person who's going to raise my hand and say, if I can't figure it out on my own, I will go find the knowledge and information in order to do things at a very high level.
Yeah, and because I don't normally think of bankers in a international MBA program. That wouldn't be one of the first things I think about. How did that? And we've talked about it before, so I know that had a big impact on you. Share a little bit about what that was like.
Yeah, well, I guess the funniest part about going to Thunderbird is I never thought I would get in there. My GPA wasn't high enough. GMAT scores weren't quite high enough. But ultimately, I decided to go pursue my MBA to get ahead in the business world. At that time, having your MBA was really a prerequisite for getting into the management or leadership side of the business. So I applied to a couple MBA programs through my professional kind of experience and resume. I actually got accepted to a handful of master's programs. But I've always loved international travel. And I thought, wouldn't that be pretty cool if a bank could ever figure out truly the international side of banking, which is very difficult given the different regulations. But my experience at Thunderbird actually really changed the direction of my life. I got to see parts of the world I hadn't seen before through some of the programs and countries we visited. I made friends truly across the globe. And it just really opened my eyes up to there's a lot more in this life than there is to, living in one city, having the same group of friends, and not experiencing the other cultures that are out there. And I think if anybody has the opportunity to travel internationally, even if it's for short snippets of time, do it, because it's going to give you a very different perspective on life, not just for fun and recreation, but also in the professional sense, because most countries do operate very differently.
Yep.
And look at Europe, for example. I'm doing a little deal with a Spanish company right now. They take the entire month of August off at that particular company. We don't do that here in the States, right? At least most companies I work with. And so really understanding how do they cram 12 months of revenue generation into 11, which is really probably closer to 10 with all the other holidays. So, how do you make that work, and what's their perspective? What's important to them? What's important to their customers? And you can actually take a lot of that, bring that back here to the States and the cities we live and work in, and really have a much more enjoyable work-life balance, which I don't really like that terminology, because I don't think you can really separate the two,
Right.
because we spend so much time working. But what I do think you get by international business, international travel is, really how do you blend those two together to maximize your life? And by maximize your life, what I really mean is, how do you have fun and enjoy what you do for work every day? And then how do you go enjoy time with friends, family, and hobbies outside of that? Because they can coexist. And ultimately, I spend a ton of time developing people on that same context, or in that same context of, let's build better humans. And it's not that I think I'm, anything special from a development perspective, but I do think if we develop people and give them the tools to be successful at work, they're happier at home. If you're happier at home, you tend to be more successful and more engaged at work, and you win on both sides of that equation. So work-life balance to me is, not exactly a great term, but really it's, how do we have a really fun life in general? Most of us have to work, myself included. And so understanding how do you get those two pieces to work together, really in harmony or in synchronization, you can have the best of both worlds and have a ton of fun doing it.
Amen. I love it. I love it. As you were talking about the international, I don't think I quite read as many books as you do, but I'm trying to catch up. But some of the things I subscribe to, I just read something the other day. They were comparing the number of hours people work in a week, and all over the world. And Germany's only like 30 hours a week. And I'm sitting there looking, we're working like 50 and they're working like 30. And nobody's ever said the Germans aren't highly productive. So I'm sitting there going, what is it they know that we don't know? Or what are they doing that we should learn from?
Right. And I would agree with that. And there's other countries that actually work less than Germany from an hour perspective that still have really high output. And to me, having experienced some of these different work cultures in different countries, ultimately it boils down, in my opinion, to employee engagement. We're still looked at in the US as one of the most productive economies in the world. I actually look at us and say we're wildly unproductive.
Yeah.
And a lot of that is, it's the cooler talk, which is important, part of culture and building that camaraderie. But how do we really get people to work hard, drive revenue, drive profit, drive growth, and do that very efficiently? And here in my current role, I actually am pretty public about it. I don't care if my salespeople work 20 hours a week or 100 hours a week. They need to meet their objectives and hopefully want to far exceed those. And I, having done the job before, I know it can be done in 30 hours a week at a very, very high level. It's all about the choices I made day in and day out to ensure that I didn't have to work 50, 60, 70 hours a week. I enjoyed my 30, 35-hour weeks. And that really was a benefit not only to me, because I wasn't working 40 hours, but it was also a benefit to my employer, being a very high performer. And no one ever had to worry about my ability to achieve the results they asked me to achieve. And so for me, it was more of a mathematical equation. I need this much input to get X output.
So tell me, and we've had parts of this conversation before. My observation is you take your hiring and onboarding of your staff very serious. Is that Accurate statement.
Very accurate.
So share a little bit about what that looks like, because I've watched you build teams at various banks, and you always build really stellar teams that tend to outperform in many cases the whole country. How is it you think about the hiring differently than some other people do?
Yeah, great question. So hiring and firing is a really interesting topic, and specific to sales, and in my opinion, it doesn't matter what you're selling. We can teach people to sell anything. So the technical side of the products or services delivered, that's actually the easy part. So I don't focus a whole lot on the technical skills relative to the specific industry, in my case, banking. What I do tailor my questioning around and really trying to understand this person's kind of outlook on life is, do they have a good work ethic? What motivates them and why does it motivate them? Taking money off the table, because we all like money.
Yep.
But that comes and goes. And if we do a really good job at what we do, in particular on the sales side, money will always take care of itself at the individual contributor level. Really, then from there, I'm looking at their ability to be coached. I'll ask questions like, tell me about the last hobby that you took up. And how did you actually learn about that hobby to become very proficient or excel at that at a very high level? And I'll use myself as a quick example on that. I recently got into sporting clays. Well, it's not exactly a mainstream hobby. In Arizona here, it's pretty hot outside. So the summers, most people don't want to be out, shooting at, 2 o'clock in the afternoon on a Saturday.
Yeah.
Not the most fun thing. And so when it's hot, you really can't get outside a whole lot. So I went online. I found some local instructors. Then I found some online instructional videos. I found a couple of great books. Then I met with some local professional coaches, in relatively short order. And I won't bore the audience with all the details of sporting clays, because again, it's a little bit more of a niche type hobby. But I went from the lowest level shooter, they have a class system, to the highest level within 2 years, which is relatively unheard of.
Yeah.
And it's because I almost treated it like a job. However, it was very enjoyable. I had a lot of fun doing it. I met some great people. But my internal motivation to, one, excel at it, and two, more importantly, learn the foundational skills in order to be successful at it. I went out and acquired all that knowledge and then worked really hard through practice, through things and drills at home, using mirrors, using some devices that probably look really funny if anybody saw me using them. But I'll ask questions like, hey, what was the last hobby you got into? I interviewed a gentleman a couple of days ago that, he's getting into running. Okay, well, one, why did you get into it? Two, running's relatively simple. Most of us can do it without a coach. But it was interesting. This particular individual wanted to do long distance and then tie it into triathlons or Ironmans.
Yeah.
So he actually, before he ever went for a run outside, he would go to the gym, run on a treadmill. But before he ever went outside, he hired a triathlete coach to make sure his running mechanics were efficient. And then he slowly built his way up to longer distances. So he got the running piece down. Then he got the biking piece down. Again, hired a coach, did really well with that, and then hired a swim coach. And then he actually got his 3 coaches together to say, okay, now let's put a plan together to compete in an Ironman. I said, I really, really like this individual.
Yeah.
And then the one thing I think a lot of hiring managers miss is what motivates people outside of money. It might be career, moving up in their career. It might be spending time with family. It could be being more involved at church. Whatever that motivation is, if we understand that as leaders, now we can custom or fine tune things to ensure that motivation isn't impeded by their professional day or professional world.
Yep.
We can actually augment and make those things better. If we understand that motivation, we understand that they can learn and they want to be coached. To me, that's the magic of hiring people, is we really start to look at them as people and humans, not just employees and workers.
Wow, interesting. Couple of things. One, as you were describing the importance of, helping them to achieve the kinds of things that, whether it's the running or whatever, you're really talking about how to help them optimize their life.
Mm-hmm.
And
I am.
And that's critical. Tell me, earlier as you were describing your own goals, purpose came out in your conversation. How do you think about, the purpose of the bank, the purpose of your team, and the purpose of the individuals? Do you apply that as well as the motivation?
Yeah, purpose is very, very important. Purpose is also very individualistic. We all have our own purpose. We all have our own motivation. Pairing those two things together, in my purpose, I think in life, and this is constantly evolving and changing, but my purpose in life is ultimately to be a good human being. So to be a good son, to be a good brother, be a good uncle, be a great leader. That's really important to me. We're all replaceable in the corporate world at the end of the day. However, I want to create a legacy of people that have worked for me and I get to work side by side, because I actually don't think anybody works for me. I know on an organizational chart they do, but ultimately I have to provide them with the strong foundation. If I don't have a strong purpose or can provide that strong foundation, nothing else matters. We're not going to be successful.
Yep.
And so tying in the purpose of the bank or any financial services company, most of our purpose is to, enable people and companies to have a healthy financial picture or outcome. So, banking's not the most sexy industry to work in. Now, that's from the outside looking in. From the inside looking out, it's actually a really, really dynamic industry. Sorry, Rick. It's actually a very, very dynamic industry because I work with pretty much any industry on the planet, but generally speaking from a finance and banking perspective.
Yep.
But understanding my purpose to be a better human, to be a really good just human being at the end of the day, I get exposed to and see lots of things from, let's say it's a healthcare provider group.
Yep.
That maybe a manufacturer could benefit from. The manufacturer probably isn't interacting with too many healthcare professionals.
Right.
Or vice versa. And so really understanding people's purpose, again, to me, it's very unique to each individual. But going back to kind of the motivation, you can start to sense what their purpose is. Most people, I don't think, actually ever state or spend time thinking about what is their purpose in life. What is their purpose in their job? What is their purpose? Entrepreneurs are a little different because they generally all have a purpose. They found something that really excites them or solving a problem that others either couldn't or didn't know existed. And so purpose to me is a very intimate thing that I can't necessarily coach somebody to find their purpose, but if I can come across somebody who knows what their purpose is or is very purposeful, then we can augment and help actually achieve or get them at least one step closer to that purpose.
I really appreciate the way you describe that, because when we work with clients or when we teach people revenue science, we talk about, purpose has two ends of the spectrum. One's a mercenary purpose, and a mercenary purpose can be highly valued. If you happen to live in Florida right after a hurricane, you're perfectly happy to have a whole bunch of mercenary roofers show up from Minnesota or someplace and put your roof back on. So it's not that that's a bad thing. It's just a short-term fulfillment kind of thing, and there's a place for that. But then other purpose, and I really liked your description. I'm not sure many people would have thought about a bank as a place where you have a purpose-driven career. But having been in business, I know when I deal with a banker who's my partner, who actually is engaging to help me be better, because that makes the bank healthier. When the bank's customers are healthier, that is a very meaningful and fulfilling kind of purpose. And
Hmm.
so I don't think people always realize that, if you run a local grocery store and you provide employment for 15 people and you provide reasonable priced groceries for the people in the neighborhood who need to come in, there's a big purpose in that too. So I really like the way you described it. One of the things I got from what you said is that rather than talk about the purpose a lot, you just model it.
I try to.
We all try to, but I mean, that's the best any of us can do is try to model our purpose.
Right. Well, and I'm a little bit unique, I think, and maybe I'm not, but I think I'm a little bit unique. Driving to the office every day, I think really two things. One, I need to earn that paycheck that's going to hit my account every so often and make sure I'm delivering enough value to the bank for that to continue. And then the other thing is, how do I ensure that my employees have a phenomenal place to work and can have fun doing it? And that's every drive-in. It's been that way for the last 20 years. I haven't always managed people in that 20 years, but you don't have to have an official manager title to manage people or lead people.
Yep.
And so making it a little bit more fun, because I think that's where, especially in large corporations, it gets a little watered down or bogged down. It's, hey, just do your job, go home, hit repeat, and you kind of wake up 3 or 4, 10 years later, go, what happened to the last 10 years?
Yep.
We just get kind of stuck in these routines. And so I typically change my routine up every single year to keep things fresh. And that way I'm not going to wake up 10 years from now going, wow,
Where'd it go?
what happened in that last decade? I
Yeah.
want to have really fun stories, cool stories to share with people. I want people to love having me as their leader. I want them to enjoy their time while they're working. And I ultimately want them to be wildly successful because I think everybody has it in them. I think they have to understand their purpose, their motivation, what gets them excited. And then I think they have to have an organization and a leader that's going to actually support and foster and deliver on that so they can excel in their roles.
Wow. We could have this conversation for about a week. Have you read a book called Super Bosses?
I actually have not read that one, but I'm going to add that to my list.
I just finished it and it was recommended to me by a friend. And the interesting thing was the way they really defined super bosses. And part of the definition was the super bosses made all kinds of other leaders. So it wasn't that the super boss just went out and made a lot of money and got one corporation to, knock it out of the park for their tenure, but it was how many new CEOs or CFOs or other serious leaders did these people create throughout their career. And and as you were talking about, part of your legacy is to help people be successful. I thought that was just an incredible definition for what a real super boss is, somebody who makes a whole lot of other people very, very successful.
Well, I think that's the definition of a true leader is creating other leaders that can think critically on their own, who can make good decisions and who can, in the professional context, be very successful at whatever that leadership role is. And then, in my opinion, you also have to tie that back to their personal life of, are they also doing really well from a family perspective, a friend perspective, whatever they want their personal life to look like?
Yeah.
Because again, you can't separate the two. And so it's interesting you bring that up, and I'm for sure going to read that book because actually one of the things I judge myself on and actually track is how many of my historical employees move on to management or leadership roles. And that's actually the definition of what I'm trying to do with my career is making sure I'm helping that next generation or those next folks actually achieve their goal of getting into a leadership role and doing it well. Not just getting there, but they need to do it well.
Well, it's interesting when when I think about purpose, if I were able to help a lot of other people become more successful, it'd be hard to think of a more meaningful purpose. You know, you don't have to build houses, or you don't have to, you know, be a race car driver. If you help a lot of other people be more successful, wow, that's a pretty cool purpose. If nothing else happens.
Yeah, well, and I'm lucky enough in what I do for a living, it's not only our employees, it's also our clients. It's,
Oh,
it's the
yeah.
business owners, the entrepreneurs. And how do you help them be more successful? And really, to me, it always comes back to, one, are we doing the right thing for them? Because I never want to be the person accused of selling snake oil, so to
Yeah.
speak. I want to make sure we're delivering the value we promised. And if we do our jobs well as bankers, our customers will be, to your point, very healthy, very profitable. And at some point, when they exit that business, because every business has an exit, whether people want to admit that or not, we can actually help create generational wealth for those families. And that's the ultimate goal on the client side.
Yep. Amen. And it's interesting. When we in revenue science talk about the revenue culture, we try to help people realize that culture is not just the shareholders, it's not just the leadership, it's not just the employees, but it's also the client, and it's also the business partners, and it's also the community. And so, listening to you, you clearly recognize those people as part of your culture. And,
Mm-hmm.
I wish business schools would teach that. You know, you have to overcome, it's not just the shareholder. There's more people in this.
Right. Well, and it's interesting. And I'll use your example again. If the bank's healthy and our customers are healthy, we both win and we'll succeed together. Taking that one step further, there's a bank that I previously worked for. At the bottom of my pay stub every 2 weeks, right under the deposit amount that hit my account through direct deposit, it literally said these words: brought to you by our customers. And it was a really good reminder that we need to do what we do really well, deliver good experiences at fair and competitive pricing. And most of all, we need to actually deliver on the value that we've promised those customers. Because without customers, we have no business. We don't have the roles we're lucky enough to sit in, and we don't have a paycheck.
You've used the value term frequently, which I greatly appreciate. And I speak fairly often. And one of the questions I ask when I'm in a room full of typically Vistage CEOs, and I ask them a question, I say, how often this week did you take a look at the work you're about to do and identify some of the work, any of the work that you're going to do that's actually going to transfer value to your customer that they're going to be willing to pay you for? How many times a week do you do that? And I can have a room full of 15 people and not one of them did it once all week long.
Yeah, I would say that would probably be the exception, not the rule. Are you familiar with the Ivy Lee method?
I don't think so.
So it's a pretty simple method, but basically at the end of every day, you write down your to-do list for the next day in no particular order. And it can't be longer than 5 or 6 to-do items. Then when you start work the next morning, now you prioritize it. So that's the whole Ivy Lee method. And most people never get through those 5 or 6 to-do items the following day. That's assuming they're the right to-do items. I took that a little further. Because of the industry that I'm in, we're highly commoditized. There's still about 5,000 give or take banks in the country. So how do we make ourselves different? I actually added, what value do these to-do items what value will they deliver?
Yeah.
Because without that, if I can't help our customers be more profitable, be more successful, generate more revenue, pay down debt, automate, whatever the case is, if I can't provide value, I'm just like every other bank out there at that point.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that that's necessarily a bad thing, but I know we as an industry can and should do better. And that's why I think we've ultimately built some really fun teams to work on that have been very successful in driving revenue internally, but really driving value externally, because that's how I look at it. Externals value, internals revenue.
Yes, amen. And it's interesting when the CEO doesn't think about value once a week. Why on earth would the CEO expect their employees are consciously focused on value transfer throughout the day? And, if people just stopped once, and I love your model. If people just started the morning, looked at their 5 things and asked themselves which ones are transferring value to my customers that they're willing to pay me for, the businesses would change overnight.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
100%.
And the other piece you're demonstrating in everything you're saying is, and this is a very difficult one when we work with clients, and we try to get clients to decide very early on, are you a headquarters out organization or a buyer back organization? And everybody wants to pretend for a minute they're buyer back, but in about 5 minutes, you figure out every decision they make, every policy they have is headquarters out. And I don't even know how they pretend to describe value, because the customer defines value. And so if you think headquarters out, you're just guessing what the value is.
Agreed. And putting that in the context of banking, my money's green here at the bank I currently work for, just like it's green at every other bank in the country. So how do I differentiate if I'm not looking at it from the client's perspective and what value they're going to get out of it? Think about, call it $100 million manufacturing company that's relatively paper-based. Well, any bank can probably offer them cash management services to match what they've currently got. And, that'll probably work, 30% of the time, maybe 40. Who's going to really ultimately win that business and help deliver value to that manufacturer is the bank and banker that actually are thinking a little bit more like the operator and less like a banker. To say, okay, let's really look at your operations, because most bankers, and I say this because I ultimately love the industry that I work in, but most bankers are going to say, well, I want to do a loan for them. I want to see their financials. What's their EBITDA? What's their operating leverage? And those aren't bad things, but that's relatively basic.
Yeah.
Let's really talk about, okay, so to the manufacturer, how do you acquire new customers? Let's first talk about that, because if I don't understand your sales cycle and what you deliver, chances are I don't really understand your perspective or your business. So I'm not going to come up with a good solution. So the number one thing I think all bankers, or anybody in financial services for that matter, needs to do is actually stop thinking like bankers and start thinking like your customers.
Yeah.
Because your customers, generally speaking, and I'll go again a little higher from a higher industry level, go industry agnostic. If we don't understand what our clients are looking for, we don't know what value we're trying to deliver to them. If we don't understand those two things, it's really hard to make a sale.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite books. One of the things I took away from it was the difference between making money with a customer or from a customer.
Mm-hmm.
And, that's one of those that really defines whether you're headquarters out or buyer back. Because if you're using language like cross-sell and upsell and wallet share, those are all headquarters out conversations. It's headquarters wanting to go get in the pocket of all your customers, as opposed to figuring out how you can make money when they make money because you help them,
Right. Well, and I agree with you. I think those terms, cross-sell, share of wallet, I think it's a decent way to measure certain things.
Yep.
But I also think we might be missing something. And if we can't articulate what the value is based on the cross-sell or additional share of wallet, then I wholeheartedly agree with you.
Yeah, when they're
I think,
outcomes because you added more value, they're wonderful metrics.
correct.
But when they're the goal, then that's the problem.
Exactly.
So, well, we can talk forever without any trouble. tell me, one thing I'd like to ask is, your industry is one, like many, that the last 3 years or so have, you know, just thrown it up in the air and watch where all the parts fly down on the ground. Um, what do you see that the biggest changes recently are, and what's it leading to? What should we be thinking about for the banking industry as either potential bankers or customers of banks?
Yeah, well, I think certainly in light of the last, call it 3 or 4 months, I think the biggest change that we've seen is the average consumer is actually far more, or should be far more, aware of the health of their financial institution that they choose to do business with. And so, it's been an interesting couple years through the pandemic, some of the federal government programs that have come out, and it's kind of a moving target, right? The goalpost is always moving. Financial services, I believe, is still the second most regulated industry on the planet,
Yeah.
right behind nuclear, but still ahead of healthcare, which I find a little bit interesting, but here nor there. But really, I think the change we've experienced in the last, call it 2 or 3 years, has been eye-opening for the average person, at least in the US. And so what do they need to look for in a bank, and how has that changed things, and how are the banks changing things? Well, one, I think we need to look at ourselves and say, are the services that we're providing actual value add? Whether that's obvious to most people in the financial services industry, I'm not quite sure it is. But I think from our customer side, I think they're far more aware than they ever thought they wanted to be or should be. And so we've had tons of conversations around the health of our bank. What do you think about the bank we're currently with? And I'll never badmouth a bank, because I think competition is good, and I think there's a bank for everybody. And I also think certain banks have great niches that they work in,
Yep.
or pick industries that they choose to work with. But I think taking a step back, kind of going big picture in the financial services industry, I think what it's really forced us to do is really understand, how are we going to weather these storms going forward? Because there will be more in the future.
Yep.
And how do we make sure we don't end up on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, CNBC, whatever the case may be? And so I think people having an understanding of what and how a bank really operate are, and understand some basic things about banks. The number one complaint I hear from customers is, it is really hard to get a loan from a bank. And that's true. And I don't know the exact number, but I think it's about 60% of companies don't borrow money from banks.
Right.
And so you kind of take a look at that and say, well, banking as an industry, we measure success by our assets, which our assets are loans. So we're not even really accounting for, call it 60% of the companies out there. So A, did we pick the wrong metric to judge success by? Which, that's debatable. I think it's an easy one for us to look at. But really, how are we delivering what we need to deliver so the economy can still function the way it needs to? And we got a really good education in that with 2 large bank failures in 2023.
Yep.
The banking business is built off confidence and trust. And the reason it's so hard sometimes to get a bank loan is people tend to forget the money we're lending out is our depositors' money at some point in time. And it's held in trust. And so when our depositors want to pull money out, that money needs to be available to them. And so that's why banks in general are relatively conservative.
Yeah.
The other thing I think people misunderstand, and I think this more recent banking crisis has shown the general population, is the healthier the bank, the more easy you can actually get access to bank debt. Furthermore, if you have covenants on a commercial or business loan, if you actually manage to beat those covenants, I promise you, you will have a very successful business. You'll get a very good multiple when you choose to exit, and you'll actually have demonstrated to the buyer you have managed leverage or risk appropriately.
Yeah.
And so that may be a little bit more specific to commercial and business banking than you were looking for, Rick, but really I think the big things that we've learned in the last couple of years is, through the pandemic and payroll protection program, the Main Street loan stuff, all those programs were basically, the analogy I like to use is, we were building the jet on the runway while trying to take it off at the same time. And that's a pretty difficult spot to be in. And I actually really think ultimately at the end of the day, the industry did a really good job. I know at the time, businesses were pretty frustrated with it, but it had never happened before. It was wide scale and it was wildly complex. And the other thing I think a lot of people don't realize, until those PPP loans were forgiven, that was the bank's money we put out there. It was not the federal government's.
Right.
It was reimbursed back to the bank well after the fact.
Yep. Yeah, and it's interesting, Brett. I'm assuming, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like part of your job as a banker is to educate the businesses so that they really understand the context they're operating in. Is that a true statement?
That's a very true statement. In fact, we at this bank go a little further and we try to make sure that we understand what's going on in their industry within their local geographies to say, hey, and maybe let's again go back to manufacturers, and maybe they manufacture different things, but they're still manufacturing.
Right.
Hey, here's kind of some averages. We convert everything to percentages, right?
Sure.
And basically say, hey, like your gross profit margin is a little lower than what we're seeing kind of in this geography. So let's talk about that. Or your revenue growth hasn't been as fast. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about your G&A. Let's talk about labor. What are you doing to recruit talent at fair wages? Because we know inflation, once it gets into wages, is really hard to get out of the system, which is what we're experiencing.
Yep.
And how do you do more with less?
Yep.
And if we're not having those conversations, we're missing the boat in delivering the value that a bank can deliver to its customers.
Well, it's interesting. I don't think I would have ever thought of this before, but part of what I heard you say is the bank has a more strategic or more economy-wide look at what's going on, where if I'm running my company, I'm really very micro-oriented. And, I know what my particular one supplier is charging me, and I know what my labor rate is, but I really don't have much to compare it to. I mean, is that part of the value you're describing?
Exactly. So, working for a bank where we work with a lot of different industries, and we're a national bank, so I have the advantage of a national picture. I can pull information not just on publicly traded companies, but privately held companies. Now, obviously, we take names out and follow our privacy policy, so we're not disclosing anything we shouldn't. But it's pretty easy for me to convert everything to percentages and say, okay, revenue is 100%, straight across the board. Now let's go, cost of goods sold, G&A, whatever the case is. So I can now look at trends based on different industries, different geographies. I could pull a report for all manufacturers that we do business with and ultimately say, all right, here's kind of what manufacturing in totality looks like. And then I can compare that and get more and more micro or more and more regional to make it more relevant to those customers in particular. And if we're noticing, revenue growth isn't keeping up with your peers or similar companies, let's talk about it. Like one question that I'm just so shocked that a lot of commercial and business and corporate bankers don't ask their customers is, let's talk about inflation. And when's the last time you raised your prices? It's not just because you want to raise your prices. I mean, you have to maintain some margins and you have to be profitable if you're going to be around for any extended period of time. And let's talk about ideas to either extract some expense out of the P&L, or how do we actually generate more revenue off the same cost basis so we're dropping more to the bottom line. And understanding how the income statement balance sheet work together is something I think a lot of people miss, both business owners, CPAs, actually, and bankers.
Yeah. No, I agree. And, we could go on forever. I just want to ask you one last question. So I'm judicious with your time. What's the advice you have for first young people coming into business today? And please, if you'd like, speak specifically about banking. What should they be thinking about? How should they make the decision to do that? And then what's the advice you have for senior leaders who are trying to build a culture?
Yeah. So actually, my answer is going to be the same for both of them. And my answer is going to be curious, ask questions, seek out information, and learn to think critically based on your curiosity. Because all too often, I think whether you're new into a career or picking a career, we don't ask enough questions to understand if we actually would like that career. We don't ask enough questions to understand what it takes to be successful in that career. And on the flip side, to that 10 or 20 or 30-year-old senior executive or senior manager, I think they kind of get stuck. And I've done this myself. We kind of get stuck in our ways. And it's, well, we've always done it this way, so we're going to always do it this way. And I think if we take a step back and ask ourselves to be curious, I think we ask better questions. I think we think more critically. And I think we actually ultimately get to a better solution and outcome for all parties involved, the shareholders, the stakeholders, employees, clients, families. So I think the best advice I could give to anybody, whether it's a 20 or 30-year executive or somebody freshly out of undergraduate getting into the professional world, is be curious, ask a lot of questions, and learn how to use that information to think more critically, or at least think a little differently, because the answer of we've always done it this way is not always the right answer.
Well, Brett, I thank you so much. This has been a great podcast today. And is there any last word you want to leave us with?
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to spend some time with you, Rick. It's always a pleasure to talk with you. And I think a final thought would just be reiterating, try to understand your motivation, think about what your purpose is, and stay curious. And if you do those three things, I think you'll live a really, really enjoyable, healthy lifestyle.
Well, thank you so much. And for those of you who joined us, hope you had as much fun at this one as I did. And we'll see you for the next one. Thank you.